You're listening to the Ace Records podcast with myself, Pete Paphides. It's a pleasure to welcome today's guest for all sorts of reasons. In the 18, I think, years since he became The Guardian's head rock and pop critic, he's maintained a dizzyingly high standard of writing, and indeed he writes about music of all genres with a lightness and conversational vernacular that artfully belies the depth of his knowledge. That is harder to do than it looks. He's won the Record Review's Writer of the Year category at the Record of the Day Awards 8 times, and would probably still be winning it if the awards still existed. Maybe it was him that broke them. He's had his testicles flicked by Marilyn Manson and sat at Prince's feet while his hero tried to get him to sing Sign of the Times to him. I'm enjoying imagining that. His writing attracts attention from the most unlikely quarters, some of it not always welcome. A few days ago, Taylor Swift fans went to the trouble of setting up a fake Twitter account in his name so that they could then abuse it. Elton John is another fan, so much so in fact that he persuaded him to ghostwrite his official autobiography, simply entitled Me, which is out in October 2019. Latterly, our guest has also been running a successful club night, late night minicab FM, an infrequent celebration of all the AOR music one tends to hear in a minicab when feeling somewhat emotionally vulnerable at the messy end of a legendary evening. It's also a delight to meet today's guest because I've long been a beneficiary of the similarity in our surnames, receiving many compliments over the years by people seemingly unable to handle the idea that two music journalists with similar surnames can exist at the same time. I'm not Alexis Petridis, but the guy sitting opposite me is. Hello, Alexis.
Hello, Pete. That was a very lovely introduction.
A very long intro, wasn't it?
It's nice. No, you're bigging up things that I wasn't expecting to big up. So,
such as
Late Night Minicab FM, which is it was just wasn't a joke, but it has developed a life that I didn't intend. Me and the other person I started with, a guy called John Burgess, didn't really intend it to have.
It's a runaway success.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I'm not buying a yacht for the proceeds or anything, but yes, it is popular, and we're doing it up in London in November. At the
who sort of had the idea of actually devoting a club night to it?
It was in the ether. I wrote a thing for, I think, GQ magazine about 10 years ago, after I'd had an experience where I was on holiday with my then pregnant wife. And we'd gone out to dinner, and I had she was pregnant, and I'd sort of helped out by drinking her half of a bottle of wine as well as my own. And in the cab on the way home, they were playing Mellow Magic FM, and I'd said on social media, on Twitter, I've reached this sort of this kind of nirvana of drunkenness where every record they play on Mellow Magic sounds unbelievable, sounds amazing. And all these people suddenly piled in, going, oh God, yeah, no, that's happened to me. And so I wrote a piece about it. And then Jono was doing had an idea for a club along similar lines that he'd done a couple of times up in London, and sort of came to me and went, why don't we try and do one in Brighton? And the first one that we did, I was very kind of like, this isn't going to work. No one's going to get this concept. And I got this text from Jono about 8 in the evening going, where are you? I was like, putting the kids to bed, I'll be down in a bit. He goes, you've got to come down because there's literally no one else here other than me. And I thought, I'd said to my wife, I'm just going to go and I'm going to play for an hour. And I'm going to come home. It's a disaster. It was a bad idea. And then got there, and for one reason or another, the pub was heaving by about 10:30. People were going absolutely mental.
And what were the Lodestone tracks?
The Lodestone track was there were two. I guess that's why they call it the Blues by Elton John, which just unexpectedly turned into this kind of mass sing-along. And then You're So Vain by Carly Simon, which people were sort of standing on tables and da-da-da-da-da. Anyway, having said I would go out for an hour, I got back home at like 2 a.m, really drunk, having had a wonderful evening. Decided to play a bit of music when I got in, woke my wife up, terrible argument, I was consigned to the spare room for the rest of the night. But yeah, that was it. Anyway, sorry, it's like a boring anecdote, but...
when you got home, were you playing the same kind of music?
Yes, I was playing You're So Vain. I was reliving the moment of glory that was somebody else playing You're So Vain in a pub.
And of course, that... So I guess I've always loved that song. I thought, it is one of sort of Bernie Taupin's very, very best lyrics. It completely kind of, it's a total bullseye lyrical moment. of course, you're now friends with Elton, so I guess you could have told him that anecdote had you wanted.
Yeah, I don't know how he would take it. The concept of it is of the club. We're not taking the Mickey out of this music. I genuinely really love records like things that I wasn't allowed to like.
So would it be something like "Keep on Loving You" by R.E.M.?
Yeah,
would
huge,
that be a
huge,
big one?
huge tune. Yeah.
Okay.
The sort of the classics, Hour 3 Before 8, if you will, are "Coming Around Again" by Carly Simon.
Yeah.
"Zoom" by Fat Larry's band, and possibly "Stay With Me Till Dawn" by Judy Zook. It's just records that like you probably weren't allowed to like at the time for whatever reason.
It's quite close to before Guilty Pleasures turned into something else. There was just a moment at the very beginning of Guilty Pleasures where it was in some ways quite close to what you did, which is just that it's actually the opposite of irony.
Yeah,
and
totally,
and it's almost. You love these records with the sincerity that could break you.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely. I think the thing about Guilty Pleasure that's sort of fascinating is when it started, and the sort of first compilation that they put out, it was amazing because it was this sort of little buried piece of pop history. You know, Lau and I always sort of go on about nostalgia being a form of curation. And, you know, if you talk about 1976, 1977, 1978 in pop music, people, you know, automatically start talking about the first Clash album and Nevermind the Bollocks and things like that. And of course that music made, you know, zero impact on Radio 1. They weren't playing sort of Safe European Home and things like that. They were playing How's That by Sherbet.
Yeah.
And similar kind of records that were on that first Guilty Pleasures compilation. And that was the music that I heard, you know, as a sort of 7-8-year-old at that time. And it had this unbelievable emotional pull hearing it again. It was just like I'd completely forgotten about this stuff, you know.
Yeah, I mean, something like Storm in a Teacup by the Foundations is just, not only does it, I mean, it just sounds like an incredibly wise song as well to me. It's, you know, it's just, you can hold that up as, it's a song that you can live your life by in a way. And I sort of think, going back to your point about the sort of early incarnations of Guilty Pleasures, what it makes me realise is that there are some ideas that when a certain amount of people start to love them, when they become so pop, it's a bit like the luggage on Aaliyah's plane. It just Sorry, I didn't know I was going to say that.
That's amazing.
But do you know what I mean?
What a metaphor.
He can't stay up.
Yes. Yeah, it's exactly that, and maybe that's what's happened with the late night minicab thing. Maybe that's
no, you're good. I think for the time being, you're good. But also, it's more specific.
Oh, I see what you mean about it becoming so popular that
It sort of it can't survive when it becomes something different when that many people like it.
Yeah.
And so you inevitably get to a point where it's just like a hen party thing.
And also, I think the audience for Guilty Pleasures, from what I can gather, because Jono has played there quite a lot.
Yeah.
Who I do late night minicab with, and he said the audience has got a lot younger. It's the sort of amazing thing where the sort of brand has essentially survived while drawing in a younger and younger audience. So their notion of a guilty pleasure is now sort of a Katy Perry record or something like that. It's you know what I mean? It's stuff that
I've noticed. Actually, there's an adjective my kids have started using, and maybe yours do too. It's become a bit of a thing. Wholesome. They say.
Oh right, no, that's new one on me.
I really like that. That's really wholesome. And apparently a lot of their friends use it, and it's a sort of it's become repurposed to sort of describe. In its way, quite because obviously maybe to them the world is so scary, and if all your mates are doing NOS or whatever, then wholesome has become a kind of quite a cool thing in itself.
I had a very odd experience earlier this summer. I went to see Bob Dylan and Neil Young in Hyde Park, and with my friend Tom, and we were on the train back to Brighton, and we bumped into these kids that were sat on the table opposite us, and they were on their way to Brighton from, I don't know, Haywards Heath or Crawley or somewhere, going out. As we were coming home, they were going out for the night. Their night was just beginning at midnight. And we got talking to them, and they were all sort of like 17 or whatever, and they're obviously pretty drunk. And they were sort of saying, "Oh, what we've been doing? We're talking about music." I said, "What sort of music do you like?" And they went, "Oh, you know," one of them went, "I love John Denver." And I was like, "That's just a bizarre thing to," you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they were like, and then they all started singing "Take Me Home, Country Road," and they knew all the words to "Take Me Home, Country Road." So maybe that is a kind of wholesome thing to like, as opposed to listening to XXX Tentacion or whatever.
Yeah, and they listen to the other stuff. They'll listen to sort of, sort of grime and whatever, whatever the other edgy sort of subgenres there are. It's just that's in the mix as well.
That's
and
really
similar,
interesting.
Africa by Toto again is huge amongst our kids' generation.
Yeah, and I don't really understand why that would be that specific record. I don't understand if it's been used on but the way kids access music now is just, I can't get any handle on it whatsoever.
No.
God, the things that my daughters, suddenly, my eldest daughter was playing a sort of Spotify playlist in the car, and it was all this sort of, kind of YouTube bedroom poppy kind of stuff like Clairo and Girl in Red, in the middle of which She's So Lovely by Scouting for Girls came on.
Right.
Or, God, what was the thing? What was the thing that came on Pick of the Pops and she started singing along to it and she got it wrong? Oh, bollocks, can't remember.
That's right. Certainly, and also, sort of, again, on the subject, seemingly random things, the Kooks suddenly have major currency in the world of our
But there's no, I think but my theory about that, because all those bands do, all these kind of absolutely third division, early noughties indie strivers are playing like Wembley and the O2 and stuff like that. So it's not just the Kooks, it's the Wombats, people like that. And I think because no sort of big guitar act has come through, this is not the time for guitar music, really. If you like that kind of thing, and not everybody does like grime, some people are stirred at the age of 17 by the sound of peeling guitars or whatever, rather than, someone rapping or whatever. You've got to dig back into the past to find, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
stuff. And I think, I assume that's what's happening, because the people going to see the Wombats are not, I can't imagine the Wombats were ever that successful. They could have played the O2 when they were, at the peak of their. They are at the zenith of their fame now, apparently.
They seemingly are.
Yeah. It's a very, very odd thing how they access. I suppose it's that notion of there's no gatekeepers anymore. There are no access points are not rationed maybe in the way that they were when.
No,
when
time has been flattened out because you can access everything, and of
at
course,
once,
presumably, you're 2 years younger than me, I think. So that when you were first buying records, if there was something from the past that you liked, then you would have had to have ordered it in a specialist.
Yes,
from a
exactly.
shop.
Yeah.
Do you remember doing that?
Yes, I do. I remember having to go to. I grew up in Yorkshire initially, and then my family moved to Buckinghamshire. And I remember having to go to London, to the HMV shop in London, to get a copy of the third Velvet Underground album. That was not available in High Wycombe or Aylesbury.
And you can order it either.
Well, I could have probably ordered it in the local store in Amersham Record House, but the guy who worked there was a bit of a twat who had mocked me when I ordered a 12-inch by Felt.
And remember what he said?
Yeah, it was a lot of jokes about, do you want to be felt up and all this kind of thing, and I thought, well, you're a monstrous prick, and I'm not going to, I'm not going to patronise your establishment any longer. But yeah, the song I remember that my daughter knew, apparently out of the blue, that was on Pick of the Pops the other day, was "Wherever I Lay My Hat" by Paul Young, which she launched into knowing the words. But then it got to the chorus, and she kind of spoilt it by thinking the chorus went, "Wherever I lay my hat, that's where I live." So I wasn't. I know it's jarred slightly, but up to that point, she was properly. "By the look in your eyes," I don't know where.
Well, she loves it, and
she knew it. I wouldn't say. I don't know if she loved it or not. I was like, "Well, how do you know that?" She went, "Everyone knows this."
Oh, because I do find that production. I do find very hard to love.
Do you? Still, even the sound of Pino Palladino.
But Pino is, Pino moved on, didn't he? So
yes.
If he were here now, he would be very. He would strenuously remind us that he went on to play with D'Angelo and some other.
Yeah.
Cooler people.
Didn't he play?
Did he? Yeah.
I'm sure he'd be very gracious.
I think he's got a bit of a bee in his bonnet about being associated with that fretless.
Really, it's an unrevived sound, isn't it? The fretless bass. It's one of those weird things. You think?
I mean, it could be revived. I just felt like that Paul Young album. I'm as you know, I'm not especially Puritan in my kind of, I don't, there's, for instance, I I probably like Kim Wilde's version of "You Keep Me Hanging On" more than the original.
Wow.
So we're all different in that way, but with that Paul Young album, it just seems what he did to those songs it's almost like an outsider art project that. It's like he took songs that you couldn't really, that when he'd finished with them, you could never have imagined them being any good to start with.
No, Love of the Common People's like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
His version of Love of the Common People is extraordinary.
Yeah, and of course, Forever Lay My Hat. I just thought, this is just so, there is nothing here that could ever have been good in the first place. And then when I heard it, I just thought, there must be something else going on.
I think that song, in particular, Wherever I Lay My Hat, is so evocative of the summer of 1983. I was 11 or 12, and it was a very hot summer of 1983, and everything in the charts that summer sounded like hot weather. Double Dutch by Malcolm McLaren, All Night Long by the Mary Jane Girls, and Wherever but I can't work out whether in my head I've just got hot weather mixed up with the things that happen to be on the radio and now associate them as, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I mean, but then I think just afterwards, my memory could be failing me here, but I think Give It Up by Casey and the Sunshine
that was number one for all that summer.
It's sort of like came out of nowhere. It was like the cavalry had arrived. It just felt like after Paul Young, it felt like the greatest record ever made. He looked quite grumpy when he was performing that on Top of the Pops.
What, KC?
KC.
He'd been in a terrible accident, hadn't he?
Had he?
Yes.
Okay. And he had a terrible drug problem as well, didn't
he? Had he?
Yeah, I think so, yes. Anyway, we are here, obviously we're in the HQ of Ace Records, and there's so much here, there's so much that has come out on the label that I, perhaps more than anyone we've had on this podcast, which I can imagine sort of floating your boat. I'm even looking at a CD called The Pop Genius of Mickey Most, and I can just see loads of catnip here for you already.
Yes.
I'm going to hand it, and there's the Daisy Age compilation, which Bob Stanley compiled, the 3-day week thing. I mean, there are this is a label that at times, with certainly with its recent output, I can imagine almost sort of exists purely to
please me,
sate your whims.
Yeah, it's true. I think that there's a perception of Ace as a label as being slightly earnest and worthy, and quite purveyor of kind of old R&B and soul and early rock and roll and things like that, which it certainly has done a fantastic job over the years of promoting that kind of music and ensuring it's still available, but recently it's put out all this stuff that kind of I'm always fascinated by music that sort of falls through the cracks a bit. It's what I was saying to you before about stuff that falls through the cracks of history a little bit. It's endless fascination. And something like this, Mickey Most CD, which contains the original version of Living Next Door to Alice, which I didn't even know was a cover when Smokey did it, but New World did it originally. I didn't completely unaware of that until this CD
they were like an early Rack kind of failed experiment.
Yeah, it's a slightly confused label initially, Rack, before it finds its sound. It's got all these weird... I bought in a charity shop just because it was on Rack. I can't remember who it's by. It's called Lord of the Dance, and I thought, well, it's definitely not the him, right? It's the him. it's a sort of acousticy, sort of folky.
Hang on. Who did that? That was who's it credited to?
I can't remember the name of the band.
Okay, go on.
But it's one of those things where you think of Rack as this label that has this incredibly strong identity that's linked largely to the glam era and the era just after that when they had sort of Smokey and things like that. If any people are listening to this podcast because they do appreciate Ace's excavation of obscure sort of Detroit soul, I'm sometimes clearly mortified by this conversation, but
it's fine. I'm sure they can roll with it for a while.
But no, I this sort of stuff is just things like Motorbiking by Chris Spedding and Dance with the Devil by Cozy Powell and 48 Crash by Suzi Quattro. This is sort of the first music I can remember.
And Mickey, go on. Sorry.
No, that's it. And I think it just it went in at some sort of primeval level, and it's never really left me.
No, I couldn't agree more. I quite like Mickey Most's almost kind of callously utilitarian approach to making music, especially when it's when it collides with artists who maybe slightly have more high-minded ideas. So moving slightly before Rack, people like Terry Reid,
Yes,
and Donovan.
Donovan, yeah, absolutely.
Who, it's a sort of test of how badly do you want to be a pop star, and of course you go on. Sorry,
no, but in fairness, he gives Donovan space. The Mickey Mouse sort of produced Donovan albums are not, chock full of pop. I mean, they're kind of,
true.
In absolute fairness, Sunshine Superman is probably the first psychedelic record ever made, certainly recorded, first psychedelic rock record anyway. And that's come out over his ages, so he's not just going.
No, absolutely, but he kind of he does. There's that sense that it has to work as a hit. So, looking at the zeitgeist,
yes,
there's an attempt to give those artists some of what they kind of feel is recognisably theirs.
Mm-hmm.
But I do like that sort of tension between, seeing what's out, seeing what's commercially viable, and then that so much great music happens in the space between what the artist wants and what the producer can confidently
absolutely
sell.
I also like that sort of slight all hands on deck thing about Rack. Again, I didn't know this until recently, that the guy on Brother Louie on Hot Chocolate, which is on this Mickey Mouse album, the voice that goes, "Listen up, I don't want no spook in this house," it's Alexis Corner.
Oh yes, I heard.
It's Alexis Corner.
It sounds like,
he's been drafted in from, presume, some session with CCS or something like that. And it's such an extraordinary place for Alexis Corner to kind of end up doing this kind of voiceover on this slightly weird Hot Chocolate record. This great. It's unlikely you would have got, somebody else sort of pioneering figure from the British blues boom. Would ever have ended up in that position unless they were involved with Mickey Mouse.
It's true, yeah.
Maybe if John Mayall's Blues Breakers had signed to Rack, it would have been him or something like that.
It's an astounding song as well.
It's an incredible record,
I think it was a hit in America, or did someone else have a hit with it in America?
I don't know.
I think it had more success in America.
Oh, okay, right. It's a new one on me.
It's absolutely, it's fantastic. And you talked about kind of gravitating towards music that falls through the cracks, and I guess the 3-day week compilation put together by Bob Stanley is kind of abundant.
Yes, and also it paints a picture of an era which I find. I'm endlessly fascinated by the 1970s. It is sort of there's sorts of good reasons, obvious reasons to be fascinated by the 1970s. In that it's the zenith of a lot of different genres of music. It seems to me to be sort of in some ways the zenith of reggae. It's the zenith of soul music. It's there's a lot of creation and new things. But I think ultimately with me, it's just the fact that whenever you look at the 70s, whenever you look at footage of the 1970s. Even Old Top of the Pops, it looks like a very different alien world. It's the past is a foreign country. It's very little you can tie between then and our own era when you actually see it on screen. And yet it's a foreign country that I lived in and can just about remember. And there's something about that sort of tension of it seeming almost sort of mythical, weird, like somebody made this stuff up. But I was actually there and can vaguely remember some of this stuff. And I think that's the pull of the 70s for me. And I can't seem to sort of get over it.
You're doomed to forever try and understand it.
I think also, I think the other thing that sort of made it more pronounced, that sort of idea of looking into it, is kind of the world that we live in now. There's something very comfortless about the world we live in now, because all this stuff is happening. We have no idea how it's going to work out, and it's always quite appealing to look back at another era when there's loads of strife and trouble and these terrible things happening and terrorism and sort of economic meltdown and all this stuff. But there is a kind of resolution to it. I mean, admittedly, that resolution isn't always great, but at least it's got some sort of resolution to it. So I think there's something about the comfort of history about the 70s, about something like that 3-day week compilation, which is clearly a fairly miserable period in British life that it's documenting, But
you say, it's like you say about resolution. We kind of know how that story ends, or it's kind of got a beginning and middle and end, and it's and that's a great thing that I think compilations can do. We do it we sort of do it unconsciously a lot of the time. We give genre names to areas of music that no one would have known what you're on about if you'd done it at the time.
Yeah,
I mean, even you'll remember that certainly for the best part of like the era that we call Britpop, no one used the word Britpop.
No.
It just suddenly appeared out of nowhere one day.
But it was a BBC Two thing, wasn't it? I think Britpop was
BBC
Two Now, Britpop Now or something it was called, wasn't it?
Yeah, that
BBC
thing
Two?
presented by Damon Albarn.
In a pair of
maybe
+4s.
that was the. Sorry,
he was wearing a pair of +4s, wasn't he? Didn't he wearing dressed in a sort of deerstalker and a pair of +4s?
He was at some point. I can't remember if it was that programme. It might well have been.
I can't remember. I can't really remember.
But yeah, no, and I think if you're a kind of lifelong collector and lifelong music fan, then a fun thing to do is to try and create narratives, trying to draw narrative lines in different kind of periods of history that maybe weren't kind of given a name at the time. What 3 Day Week does that very well.
Freak beat is the famous example of that. Nobody called freak beat in 1965 or 66. I don't know when the term came along. It was certainly in use when I started collecting those records in the late 80s. But that's a really interesting thing. It was just R&B bands trying to sort of cope with technological advances and the influence of LSD, or the influence of drugs. And I really like that kind of idea of sort of trying to mould. I'm sure if you look at the artists on 3 Day Week, there's kind of sort of serious artists. Well, I'm not saying that Lieutenant Pigeon aren't a serious artist, but there's this kind of swathe of people who had very, very different intentions in their music, and were in some way consciously or otherwise, usually unconsciously, affected by current events. What was going on in the country somehow seeped into their sound, and I think that is quite an instructive thing to sort of recognise in the current era of pop music that we're living through, where it is seen to be, absolutely de rigueur for everybody, pop artists, rock artists, whatever, to be making a point about current events, to be very firmly saying that, body positivity is a good thing and gender neutrality is a good thing and everybody, this, that and the other, and you've got to have a song about these things, and if you don't, you get kind of took to task. It's like, oh, right, you go back there and write a song about how bad Donald Trump is. And then you better do it properly because you've not done it right. There'll be a thing, we're going to check what words you've used. And if you look back at the past generally, I understand why people want that. I understand why people want music to be reactive, directly reactive to current events. It is largely, it seems to me, to be completely antithetical to history. If you look at musical history, generally speaking, there are very, very few instances where the charts were filled with songs that were reacting. There's very brief period from sort of the end of punk to sort of the demise of two-tone, where it absolutely happens, and Ghost Town's number one, and that's one period. It doesn't. It's very difficult to think of other periods. Maybe the sort of folk boom or whatever.
Well, but even with the sort of, I think, even Ghost Town, I think, is a song that is just non-specific enough to be. I think if it was any more specific, it would be a worse song. It's just it's describing a scene, but it's kind of it's not didactic, which I think is important.
That's really
and I think I think in a way, that's kind of what I realised in the end. That probably the reason why I don't listen to too much sort of straight ahead folk music or the kind of folk music sort of that just describes a thing that happened. Folk songs that almost exist in lieu of a newspaper.
Yes, absolutely, like a broadside or whatever. Yeah.
And I kind of, I'm not even sure what part they have to sort of play in the contemporary age anymore. I can sort of see that they did once upon a time.
Yes, in the 19th century or something like that. It's completely what folk music's for, right? Or one of the things that folk music's for.
But there's something that makes me want to chew my own fist off if I accidentally sort of find myself in an audience, just sort of hearing someone kind of very specifically itemize all the reasons that they, didn't like Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah. I think
even though I might agree with them. I think
there's two things. One, the thing that I love about Ghost Town is that when Ghost Town was number one and the streets of Britain are burning, and I've made this point before, but it's endlessly amusing to me. and it's this great moment where pop appears to be commenting on the news as it happens. What's number 2 in the charts is Bad Manners' cover of the Can Can. So, but for a few thousand record sales, you could be watching photographs of Toxteth going up in flames with Buster Bloodvessel singing doing the Can Can as the soundtrack,
Which, in fairness, would look, it'd be almost like something from the day to day, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. You could cut the footage of people running backwards and forwards and sort of knocking police cars over and then pulling them back up again,
Yeah.
That's one thing. And also, I think, if you look historically at any given era, or lots of different given eras, the music that tells you the most about that era is not necessarily the sort of most obviously engaged or didactic or whatever. It's the music that if you want to understand what it was like living in Britain in 1975, you were probably better off not listening to some incredibly politically engaged prog band like Henry Cow. You're probably better off listening to Dr. Feelgood, who on one level aren't political at all, but something of, they're playing songs that are already, 10, 15 years old, but something of the desperation and the grimness of that era has seeped into the very sound of Dr. Feelgood.
And that in itself is interesting, the fact that in the first part of that decade, a lot of bands were suddenly covering old rock and roll songs, and it was a lot of the people that became kind of pop stars were people that tried to become pop stars in the previous decade, and failed, and but just kind of sewed a few more sequins onto their clothes.
Well, I think there's two things, isn't there? It's really, it's the early 70s is the first example of the sort of 20-year revival cycle. So you get that kind of 50s revival in the early 70s. That's linked into the history of Ace Records because it's kind of, it's linked to Rock On and starting and things like that. But, you see it in everything from, Wizard dressing up like Teddy Boys to the big 1972 rock and roll revival show at Wembley. So there's that. But there's also that sense when glam comes along. I mean, if you look at what happens with glam, it's heralded by these two guys that aren't really taken seriously up to that point. Mark Bolan is certainly not taken seriously in any way by the kind of late 60s underground. He's seen as narrativist, he's seen as, if you read sort of books like Jonathan Green's Days in the Life, people really hated him because they thought he was like cocky and he was wanted to be. So there's him, and then there's David Bowie, who's just tried everything to be famous, and as this kind of total last shit or bust gambit goes, actually I'm gay, and it sort of works. So you're looking at that from the outside. And it's like, hang on a minute, what, they're in charge all of a sudden? What, David Bowie and Mark Bolan? It's like, right, all bets are off. Anybody can be famous, right? I used to be Shane Fenton, now I'm Alvin Stardust. I used to be Paul Raven, now I'm Gary Glitter. Do you know what I mean? All these people rush into this kind of, it's not void, it's just like a sudden opportunity.
Yeah, because I guess there wasn't too much else happening anyway, and if there was that sort of commercial vacuum where, okay, well, this is kind of the best idea we've got, and obviously in the case of, certainly with David Bowie, well, what's interesting, I kind of, as you know, I like going through old music papers a lot and seeing what was happening sort of at the time, as I'm sure you do as well. It's always good to kind of remind yourself just how slow things were to sort of gather ground.
Right.
And in terms of what 1972, the release of Ziggy Stardust, it wasn't suddenly like, okay, everything is called off. It's just mainly we're mainly thinking and talking and writing about David Bowie from this moment on. It was a lot slower than that. The cover stories of NME and so forth were far, were probably more concerned with what, I don't know, like Wishbone Ash were doing.
Medicine Head or something.
Yeah. And there's just this slow kind of drip feed of like, it's kind of led actually more by the kind of growing audiences going to see them, rather than, you got the feeling music journalists by and large were kind of slightly caught short by the importance of it.
Well, I suspect because of the people that were in charge. I suppose if you were a kind of, a cool NME writer, you'd probably maybe graduated from the underground press in the late 60s, something like that. These were not people you especially took seriously. You're not going to take David Bowie that seriously. No. You're not going to take Mark Bolan that seriously. So as it turns out, they absolutely have the key to the future in their hands. They completely know what they're doing. Well, I don't completely know what they're doing, but they definitely have an idea of what they're doing. And
something's caught flame.
Something that's caught flame, and they've had this thing that chimes with people, and that is changing things utterly. And I could totally understand why you'd be like, yes, but of course it's Jethro Tull. It's
yes.
It's not taken seriously. You've had that division of John Savage always talks about the division between sort of singles buyers and album buyers. That's taking place, and for all that Ziggy Stardust is a wonderful album, Electric Warrior is a wonderful album, they were singles artists. That's it's still about the 7-inch single, to me. So I think there's a sort of snootiness about that at that era as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about, funnily enough, last night I was watching the BBC 4 programme in which Jeremy Deller goes to a classroom. You've seen it as well, haven't you?
Yeah, Everybody in the Place.
And sort of talks to, for people who listening who haven't seen it yet, who talks to a classroom full of school kids in London, I think, about the kind of the causal chain which led up to the sort of acid house kind of revolution in this country, and the kind of how the sort of social unrest around the miners' strike kind of coalesced from one thing into another. And I really enjoyed the footage. I enjoyed it. There was a lot about it I enjoyed, and I love Jeremy Deller, but I was kind of it was surprised me in a way that the last 5 minutes, in which he sort of seemed to almost surprised himself by coming to the conclusion that things are never going to be as exciting as this again. And there's this slight kind of downcast look in the eyes of all the kind of school children. Is this what you come here to tell us? That actually this specific set of circumstances can never happen to in a way that would involve us again?
I think that's really interesting, because one of the points he's making in that programme is, he says, Britain was this incredibly divided country. It was divided in a way it hadn't been divided maybe since the 1930s or something like that, because of the miners' strike, because of kind of the sort of Thatcherite notion of how Britain should be sort of coming to fruition. And that's what led people wanted a bit of positivity and togetherness, and, dance music and ecstasy provided that. Well, why couldn't that happen again? Do you know what I mean? We're living in incredibly different. There's never been in a more divided time for Britain than we live in now. So why? There's got to come a point where people are going to, you know what I mean?
Also, a lot of the best music that was featured in that documentary was American.
Yes, and has nothing to do with the social situation in Britain.
Yeah, and I'm sure maybe you can draw kind of sort of causal links, but really by the time Castle Morton was happening, and Spiral Tribe had a kind of huge presence in this documentary. Whatever the virtues and whatever great things that Spiral Tribe acted as a catalyst for, the music did not remotely figure into. No. And so it seemed a bit harsh to me that you've got a bunch of children. I can name sort of 10 grime records or 10 Afrobeats records that have come out in the last 5 months alone that are just way more exciting than anything that.
Yes, completely. I think the only sort of justification for the argument that he's making is that the change that we've lived through in the last sort of 10, 15 years is probably the most profound change that's affected, to my mind, the most profound change that's affected pop music since the 1950s. In that it is no longer the centre of youth culture. Something's changed. Social media is now the centre of youth culture. When I was a kid, it was the means by which pop music was the means, for better or for worse, by which ideas about fashion, politics, everything was transmitted. Because there wasn't really any other options. It was music or sports, and that has changed. So it no longer, it is one of a number, people are still interested in music, but it's one of a number of things. There's a lot of things jostling for your attention now. It's probably easier if you've got something to say to make your point on social media than it is to start a band and make a record or whatever. So I could sort of see, that sense of things being different now, and a bit more atomised than they were, and sort of wondering if there's a kind of the potential for a kind of mass movement anymore. But then, as you say, I look at, you know, Dave at Glastonbury or Stormzy at Glastonbury or whatever. You know, Jeremy Deller did say in an interview that he compared grime to two-tone, which I thought was a really interesting comparison that nobody's sort of previously made. And clearly this is music that impacts upon people. This is music that people care about. This is music that speaks to people about their day-to-day lives. So yeah, I think that's a completely fair point, and I would rather listen to it than the sort of acid techno that Spiral Tribe were playing.
Well, how do you said that, you know, you made the point that maybe social media is at the centre of most kids. Is that true of your children?
Yeah. I think that you know, they're a bit your Instagram for my eldest daughter, and they're both into something called TikTok, which is kind of like you make short videos and then post them, and people comment on them. So you get these weird. There's a thing at the moment where there's this. People invent a dance that goes with a certain song, and there's a dance. To the chorus of "I'm Still Standing" by Elton John, and that's the kind of thing. And everybody tries to copy this dance and post videos of themselves copying this dance. So yeah, it is. I mean, they are into music, and I also think, you know, you do see artists that kind of cut through that to a certain degree. And for my eldest daughter, it's Billie Eilish, and I think Billie Eilish's impact on sort of teenagers, generally particularly teenage girls, cannot really be underestimated. She's just huge in a way that no one else seems to have.
Yeah, no, same with my kids. So I guess, you know, it's professionally incumbent upon you to be able to kind of unpack that, and sort of explain it. First of all, do you feel like you're able to anyway? Do you feel like you can do that more because you have her target audience in your house?
Yes. Yeah, I do. Yeah. And also because I knew about it before anybody was writing about it. I went to The Guardian, 6 months before they ran a feature on Billie Eilish going, look, there is this thing happening. I don't really know anything about her, but it's all my daughter's talking about. It's all her mates talk about. Da. So there's that. And there's also just that lovely thing of seeing it through your kids' eyes, you know, which happened. I took my daughter to see Billie Eilish at Shepherd's Bush Empire, and it was sort of brilliant because it was a proper. Every other gig she's been to has been in a stadium or an arena or something like that, in a big pop show. And this was Shepherd's Bush Empire, which, you know, it's not the Roxy, you know, it's not the Vortex, but it was properly elbows out and people shoving you and spilling beer all over. It was felt like a more rock and roll atmosphere, and seeing this kind of effect that it had on her, the sort of absolute, the kind of emotional intensity with which she felt it, and she was just in floods of tears throughout the gig. And I was like, to the point I was going, are you all right? And she was, I just love her so much. I love her so much. And I thought, God, that's just, oh God, if you want to bottle that feeling if you can, and because that's the greatest. It's just when music touches you that deeply and affects you that emotionally, it's just the greatest feeling in the world outside of falling in love. It's like falling in love.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, totally. I couldn't agree more. It's great that it still happens.
Yeah,
it's happening a lot. And what was I going to say? Oh, something on the back of Billie Eilish that I was going to.
What were we talking about? Unpacking phenomenon.
Oh yeah. Just and do they have a handle on? So you mentioned this thing about sort of I'm Still Standing. You know, I was going to ask you about the Elton book anyway.
Right.
But before we get onto that specifically, are they at a point now where, you know, the things that you do professionally can be impressive to them?
Yes and no. With Elton John, they're sort of aware of who he is now, but previously he was just like this guy I knew. Do you know what I mean? And my eldest daughter met him about 4 years ago, and she just thought she was meeting her dad's mate. You know, it was like my mate Steve that I go to the pub with or something, you know what I mean?
It must be nice for you to see that happen, to know, obviously, knowing as you know your kids, to see that that's what's happening.
Yeah. So there's that sort of thing. I think when it's somebody that, you know, they have an awareness of, you know, that's actually in their world, then they have a sort of feedback. They don't think, you know, what they don't think that people always say to you. I'm sure people say this to you. as a music writer. Oh, your kids must have really cool music taste. I bet you play, like I'm sitting at home playing the fucking Trout Mask replica or something, or John Coltrane records or something. Listen to turn this off and listen to Sun Ra. That's not how it works. And they don't think, those. You want to listen to that stuff, it's there. But they don't have any interest in it, and I've not tried to engender.
No, and they'd probably hate you if you tried.
I couldn't think of anything that's more likely to stub out your love of music. If my dad had come in when I was, 9 years old and gone, there's this amazing new band called Adam and the Ants. Adam and the Ants were the sort of the flashpoint for me. They were the thing at which everything took off for me. But if my dad had introduced, I don't want to know Adam and the Ants.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't want him to understand.
No. God, no. So that's the last thing that they can discover that stuff for themselves.
Now we've talked about this before, but you sort of a lot of various kind of rites of passage that you've had in music throughout your life, and you were kind of very heavily into that kind of post C86 sort of indie scene, and. At that age anyway, you can be quite tribal in your outlook. I don't know if you were, but you still. What's kind of interesting to me is sometimes I kind of ask myself, ask questions of myself vis-a-vis sort of are you a bit I wonder if I'm a bit like my quality control has sort of gone down because I am a bit less sort of tribal in that way, and and whether or not what I have to do sort of professionally, kind of getting to know musicians who maybe I wouldn't ordinarily have sort of got to know and stuff, and whether or not that's kind of mellowed me out irrevocably, or whether or not that would have happened with age anyway.
I think it's like with age. I think if you still, I think there's something, and God bless the people who are still doing this, but I think there's something faintly pathetic about sort of being tribal about music when you're 50. It just doesn't. It's not for me. I wouldn't want to. The broadening out of my music taste, the fact that whenever I watch one of those Top of the Pops repeats from the sort of mid '80s or whatever, I can guarantee the record I liked the most on it now would be the record I liked the least back then. I was not stanning, as the young people say, for The Captain of a Heart by Doublé when it came out, but I just thought this is just brilliant, So I wonder if that, and I also wonder if does your quality control go down if you're not tribal? Maybe your quality control goes down if you are tribal because you're willing to accept second-rate stuff as long as it fits within your kind of idea of what. I probably listened to quite a lot of indie music in 1986, 1987 that I don't think is very good now, simply because it fitted with the aesthetic of what I liked. So I don't think it's kind of. I don't know, but then there's part of me that goes, God, I do sort of feel like these days, I like a bit of everything. I do like a bit of everything.
I just feel, like you have these moments where, like 5 years ago, it was like Mumford & Sons, where sort of, lots of people I know and like and respect despised, wanted Mumford & Sons to die. And then it happened with Ed Sheeran, who you've interviewed.
I have,
and you got on very well.
He's a lovely man.
And he's the guy that like loads of people want to die right now. And I like his poppy. I like Shape of You. I like Nina. I like Don't. Those are the Ed Sheeran songs I really like. And I've never interviewed him, but if I'd interviewed him and come away liking him, I would be slightly niggled by the teenage me who go, do you know what I mean?
But the fascinating thing about that is that it has always happened. There's always been this kind of weird. Always, certainly since the late 60s, there's been this weird thing where somebody is pootling along, as Mumford & Sons were being, a sort of thing, and then suddenly overnight, it happened with Coldplay, it happens with sort of lots of people, become this kind of vessel in which is contained everything that is wrong about music and our ear and and I think I'm right in saying certainly the first people I can reading back that it happened to Simon and Garfunkel. where if you read sort of contemporary reviews, there comes this point about 1968 where people just turn around and go, no, fuck these guys. It's self-absorbed middle-class New York bullshit. And it doesn't matter what Simon and Garfunkel do. They start making these weird TV documentaries about the war in Vietnam and sort of American involvement in Central America. And it's really got nothing to do. And people are still, no, they're not part of the thing. You know, Paul Simon's first solo gig, which was at some sort of hippie-ish festival, I think in New York, he was booed off.
Wow.
Which sounds an incredible thing. They've just had, let us not forget, Simon and Garfunkel have just had the biggest selling album of 1970.
Yeah.
And he comes on stage and he gets booed off.
I'm wondering, according to this mic, because I didn't really know that was the virulence of the hatred to them. Does that mean that when they came back with Bridge Over Troubled Water, was that their Beatle bum?
Yeah, I think Bridge Over Troubled Water made it just made it worse. I think Bridge Over Troubled Water was their what would be the Ed Sheeran song? That we found love just where we are. People are just like, oh no, I hated them before. Now this kind of quasi-religious balls they've come up with.
Right.
So yeah, I think Bridge Over Troubled Water was their what was it, Sigh No More? Was that Mumford and Sons album that people hated?
Yeah.
Fix You by Coldplay. That's the equivalent.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. Just a couple more questions. The Elton book is out
October the 15th.
And how long? There must have been a lot of conversations with him.
Yeah, I think I interviewed him 24 times over the course of about 3 years for the book.
And did you sort of agree about what should go in, what the interesting stuff was?
Yeah, I think so, because I think that it's a mass market book. So obviously you want it, and that is also part of him as well, this sort of celebrity gossipy kind of, the guy knows everybody. He has the best stories about, some really remarkable stories about whether it's about John Lennon or it's about the royal family or this kind of insight into what these people were like behind closed doors. It's fascinating. So you definitely wanted that in there, and also just the nature of his life, from the point where he finds fame onwards, really, has been such a sort of, awful cliche, such a roller coaster of kind of these insane highs and these appalling lows and this ridiculous overconsumption of drugs and this ridiculous overconsumption generally, that all that has got to be in. That is part of him. You're not putting that on him. But I think there were aspects of his career that I was, personally interested in, that he might have been pleased that I was interested in. I was certainly interested in him, his pre-fame years in the 60s. I think that, we hear an awful lot about the sort of story of the 60s as told by the winners. You hear about the 60s. There are a lot of books out there about sort of groovy people hanging around the Indica Gallery and going to the UFO club and all that kind of thing. And, and then we all went back to Paul McCartney's and smoked some pot. And there's another 60s. There's lots of different 60s, but there's another 60s happening in the music scene in London. These people with their noses pressed against the glass. That the vast majority of him go on to be, not the vast majority of him, a great number of him go on to be hugely famous in the 70s. Yeah. It's Rod Stewart or David Bowie, as we've already discussed. And he sort of embodies that a bit. And his career at that point, I just find, his career as a jobbing musician on the fringes of things, but he is sort of going to the Speakeasy and all these kind of hangouts, but he's not being invited to the Beatles table. You know what I mean? I said he had a gang of people he used to hang around with, and one of them was this guy who called himself Hans Christian Andersen, who's a sort of hippie, sort of very fey kind of hippie troubadour, and the spell was apparently broken of this sort of ethereal fairy tale quality. Whenever he opened his mouth, and he had this like thick Accrington accent, and he said, he's great, funny little guy. We used to hang around with him all the time. And then this guy changed his name to John and became John Anderson, the lead singer of Yes.
Amazing. So
there's this sort of notion of all these people that are kind of, some people go on to make it, some people don't. Yeah. And, he had these, there's a story about one of the, I think it's Sibylla's, one of the sort of rock star hangouts. And he was sort of saying, the most amazing thing about that place was the barman was this guy called Harry Hart. And he said he was incredibly camp gay man. They used to speak in Polari. And you'd go, And he said he had this thing on like a vase on the bar. And you'd go, oh, you know, a gin and tonic, please, and have one yourself, Harry. And he'd go, oh, thank you, love, boner. Just one for the pot. Would pour out a measure of gin and put it in the vase, and then drink basically a vase of neat gin over the course of the night. It just seems to be this kind of weird. So there's all this kind of stuff happening. The Beatles are over there, you know, and they're drinking scotch and coke and you know, talking about Bob Dylan or whatever. And there's this kind of, you know, like old gay guy serving at the bar, drinking a vase full of gin. You know, those kind of details I found really
brilliant. And did he understand why you found those details?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of, he worked for a guy in the 60s. There was a promoter that Bluesology went to work for, and he was the guy that put them out, sort of backing people like Major Lance and sort of 60 stars who would come over. But if 60 stars did not come over, this guy would just go to an area of London with a high Afro-Caribbean population, so Brixton, find 4 black guys, 5 black guys, musicians, put them in a band and bill them as the Tempting Temptations. And so they'd go off and tour the Tempting Temptations, and nothing to do with the Temptations at all. And if anybody complained, everybody, you know, because he said the thing was, you know, nobody's really seen Motown acts, you know, they hadn't really appeared on TV a lot. No. If anybody complained, he would go, of course not the Temptations. I never said it was the Temptations. It's the Tempting Temptations, completely different band, you know. So he sort of, this guy inadvertently invents the tribute act, which I find that sort of thing.
And it was happening in holiday camps in holiday resorts in Spain decades later. You know, preying on the ignorance of you know, ensuing audiences. I had so many more questions to ask you, but I know you've got to get onto a playback imminently. So the stuff about disco, Tom Moulton, Westbound Disco, that'll be a record that you're going to grab on the way out.
It will, yeah.
But for now, all that remains is for me to thank you. It's been fantastic, Alexis. Always lovely to catch up with you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Pete.
And we better get off because I think I'm giving you a lift to the playback.
It's very, very kind of you. Thank you so much.
For more excellent music, you can scoot over to the Ace Records website, www.acerecords.co.uk, for all the wonderful music you could possibly need.